Kubernetes for Humans.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Kubernetes for Humans podcast. I'm today at KubeCon, London, and I have Lukas with me. Lukas, happy to meet.
Yeah, awesome to be on the live version of the podcast.
We try our best. So, Lukas, can you introduce yourself, your company, and
Sure.
what do you like about Kubernetes?
Yeah, I'm Lukas, CEO and co-founder at Loft Labs. We are the makers of vCluster. We got the open source project started in 2021. Launched another open source project about 2 years ago called DevPod. And we launched another product yesterday called vNode. The reason why we have these different products in different areas of Kubernetes is we're trying to really virtualize the entire cloud native stack. We started with the core piece, which is Kubernetes.
Yeah.
You asked what I like about Kubernetes? A lot of things. I think Kubernetes is an amazing tech. I wish it would have more multi-tenancy built in, because I think it is one of the biggest obstacles in Kubernetes adoption. And in order to get the actual potential of Kubernetes, like Kubernetes wasn't designed to create 3,000 little shared clusters.
Nope.
And a lot of people have to do that today.
And yet this is the reality, right?
Exactly. And we want to help them get to what Kubernetes should, is designed to be, right? When you think of the origins like Borg and stuff like that, right? Borg is not like 5,000 Borg instant. It's one big distributed system, right? And that's when you get all these benefits out of Kubernetes. So we help people spin up larger clusters, run virtual clusters on top of it, and have secure multi-tenancy at that Kubernetes layer. And since yesterday, with the vNode announcement, we also allow you now to virtualize nodes and have security at the node level to separate things by vCluster.
So, I know vClusters, which is like a super famous project. Maybe share a bit more about yourself. Like, how did you get into, tech in general, and more specifically, why, or like the origin of the vClusters? Like, why should someone want a virtual cluster when he can have a real cluster, right?
Yeah, how do you wake up in the morning and say, we're going to virtualize Kubernetes, right?
Yeah, it's not like the first thing that comes to mind, right?
Exactly, yeah.
And it doesn't sound easy. It's not like it's, I'm going to do it like in a day or whatever.
Yeah, it was a journey. I think, we actually ended up building vCluster as part of a pivot. So we started with a PaaS offering. We launched an open source project in, I think, 2018, and that was called DevSpace. It's a CNCF sandbox project today. And, we built this product called DevSpace Cloud, which is a PaaS, right? It's kind of like a Heroku, but for Kubernetes.
Okay.
We had a free tier, lots of free tier users, right? I don't think we hit the, product market fit ever. There were a lot of, I think, I would say a lot of free users loved the offering, right, for their hobby projects, but not a lot of commercial traction. And, so we had to really, when you're running a PaaS, you're effectively doing hosting for people in the end, right?
Yeah, you're becoming your own mini cloud provider, whatever.
Exactly, yeah. So we had to run Kubernetes very efficiently because, as I said, we didn't have a lot of commercial traction, but we had a lot of free user traction, right? So we had to constantly think about, giving everybody a separate EKS cluster just wasn't, viable.
No,
right?
that makes sense.
So we had to see, okay, can we hand out namespaces? How do we secure namespaces? Then we had a lot of folks that wanted to do things across namespaces, right? And then we're like, okay, how do we open things up so you can communicate across namespaces, but only within your tenant, right? And then, we were running these large Kubernetes clusters on a multi-tenant way, and it was a huge pain. It was a huge pain because vCluster didn't exist, right? So we were thinking, okay, how would we actually solve this problem at its core, right, for ourselves? But then we also saw this opportunity, right? Because obviously the PaaS, wasn't commercially viable. So we were wondering, if we have this problem for our PaaS, maybe others have this problem as well. How does, big Fortune 500 company with their 30,000 developers, right, split things up internally? And turns out they don't. They just create 3,000 EKS clusters, right? So, that's essentially why, we saw a commercial opportunity that we thought could actually be bigger than the PaaS that we're working on. And I think looking back today, that was the right move.
Yeah,
right?
I think it was the right move. And you also already impacted the industry as a whole, I think, with this virtualization. So you're taking what you built in-house, you're creating vClusters. Share with me maybe a bit about the adoption, like who is using it, why should I use it, and why do you have 2 new projects? Like why should I use them?
Yeah. I mean, adoption is always tricky with open source
Yeah,
projects,
so
right? Because
tricky.
you put it out there, so many people are using it. Just
None of them are paying you though, right? Like that's the tricky thing.
Yeah, it's true. It's a rough transition. So obviously the ones that are paying customer, like we're very familiar with those. We're in 7 Fortune 500 companies. There's tons of smaller, mid-sized companies using us commercially, right? The open source is a lot more vague and bigger though in terms of the community. But we have about 4,000 people in our Slack community, for example, right? I think we have like 10K GitHub stores, something like that, right? There's a lot of traction in the vClusters open source project. And what is always the most fascinating thing for me is when people hit the ground running, they become successful with vClusters and have never talked to us, right? Just like last week, we had somebody contribute, a couple lines of code, and they opened an issue to explain why they made that change. And just casually they threw out there, we would really love to add this feature because we have 1,000 virtual clusters running, and this would really help. And the username was like potato or tomato or something like no profile picture, nothing. And I was like, they run 1,000 virtual clusters. Who is this, right? Like which company is this, right? It turns out it's a really large insurance company. Like I was able to I Googled for a while, found out who the person is, reached out and said like, thanks for your contribution. By the way, what are you doing with 1,000 virtual clusters? I'm super curious, right? But it's amazing to see like people. That's I feel like you have to have. Some people have like a very light open source, right? It's not necessarily allowing you to do a lot of things, right? And the opposite is you have too much open source and you don't get enough commercial. It's like a fine balance, right?
You're always like fighting yourself in a way, right?
Yeah.
Like finding the right balance. So
it's very important. So we are very transparent with our community that we are a commercial company. We need to make payroll, right? And everybody a lot of our customers are building software as well. They want to get paid, right? And a lot of their offerings are actually, proprietary pieces of software, right?
Most of the world, right? It's not like open source, whatever.
Exactly. So it helps being transparent with people and say, okay, we have a lot of innovation in the open source. We're giving it to you for free, no strings attached. You run with it. But here's the line to this is the commercial features. This is the
so where is the line?
Right?
Where is the line for you guys?
So the line for us really starts when you have a lot of virtual clusters. Apparently, you can even spin up 1,000 without vCluster. But typically, once you get to like 100 plus virtual clusters, when you get to virtual clusters in production that needs to be very, very hardened, resilient, right? It's those kinds of features that are for us in the commercial offering. The commercial offering has 2 pieces, right? It's like if you will, it's like a fork of the open source with additional features in the vCluster to make every vCluster more scalable, faster, more resilient, right? But then we also have what we call the vCluster platform, and that really helps you manage your fleet of virtual clusters.
Fleet management for vClusters.
Exactly, yeah. That's the kinds of things like you want SSO and audit logging for all your vClusters, you hook them up to the platform, no problem. Right?
That sounds really cool. So share with us, you had a huge announcement yesterday, right?
Yeah.
What was it?
Yeah.
Why do I need something else if I already have vClusters?
Right. Yeah. What we announced is vNode. So we're going a level deeper on the stack now, right? vCluster is control plane isolation. It's really great if you want to give people a separate cluster without giving them a separate cluster, right? They can do CRDs, they can do multiple namespaces, but they're still locked into a single namespace in the host cluster, right? And all of these higher level objects in Kubernetes, like, CRDs, deployments, stateful sets, right? None of that actually has to do with spinning up a container, right?
I agree.
So what we have in the underlying, traditional cluster is just the parts of that virtual cluster, right? And they get launched by the underlying cluster. So now you have the situation where, 2 vClusters running in 2 different namespaces use the same underlying node in the traditional cluster, right? And
it's a problem?
Yeah, the question is, how do you keep things separate, right?
Yeah.
So you can restrict hard, take a lot of privileges away from them, make it really harden the way you run images, right, etc. But it's never going to be perfect. in terms of keeping things isolated. And you're going to restrict users very heavily. The other thing you can do is you can say, okay, I'm going to configure my vClusters to run in the same cluster, but I'm doing separate node pools per vCluster.
Right? Makes sense.
But that is a lot of overhead, a lot of cost, right? It's maintenance effort, right? You've got to configure that, and it makes it much more static. So the ideal vision would be you can have the same node, right? You can have shared nodes, but in a secure way. And there's a couple of alternatives out there, and we've seen our customers over the past 4+ years, right, explore all kinds of available tech out there, right? Mm-hmm. There's Kata containers, which creates micro-VMs, which probably works in your private cloud or on your bare metal Kubernetes clusters, but it's not going to work in a public cloud with nested virtualization, very problematic, right? But even in private cloud, VMs have a lot of overhead, right?
That's a problem, right?
It's another issue. You're using a lot of capacity just to spin up these micro-VMs, right? And then you have other alternatives like GVisor, right, which is SecComp filtering. But GVisor is a Google product, works great if you're using GKE, not so great anywhere else, right? And then you have things like Sysbox, which is using user namespaces. Sysbox, obviously part of Docker now, right, through an acquisition, is a product that is designed to run in Docker, not so much designed for Kubernetes, right? Like we've seen our customers struggle with any of these tech. There's a couple more, right? Like our customers have done, they've forked projects, try to make it work, right? And we've seen them struggle for years. So we're like, why don't we solve this for our customers, but also for anybody else who needs node level isolation? So we announced vNode. vNode is a combination of SecComp filtering and user namespaces. And what we ultimately do is we create virtual nodes that are not virtual machines, right, on the host node. So you can even run a privileged container as root with host PID, right? You see the entire process chain on the container and you on the node, and you feel like you're complete admin. You have an entire node to yourself.
How do you do it? It's like Linux magics on top of the nodes. Like how does it work?
It's a lot of Linux kernel magic, right?
Yeah, because
absolutely.
This is how it sounds like. Because at the end of the day, let's be honest, when we're running on AWS or GKE, they're not giving you like a real bare metal node, right? Like they have like the concept of some virtual machine and on top of that virtual node. So like it does exist, but it sounds very tricky to implement. Like it sounds like
it's a lot of,
and it's also open source, like all of that, like
vNode is a commercial product. Yeah,
completely commercial, no open source at all.
This is the first time we're doing completely commercial offering, so let's see how that goes. But day one, so it's been about 24 hours since the announcement, right? And we've had a lot of requests come in about this project, to the extent that I'm not sure if we can let everybody into, like, it's a private beta right now, right? It's it's not like a offer you can just like free trial download, right? It is very easy to set up. It's just a Helm chart. It sets up a daemon set in your cluster, so it runs a lightweight container on each one of your nodes, and that container is going to talk. It's going to register as a runtime. So you see a runtime class in Kubernetes, and every part you're starting with that runtime class is going to be packaged into a virtual node, right? So we're creating when container D from the kubelet, gets the instruction, hey, spin up this pod, we actually create that sandbox environment and then place the pod inside of it, right, to isolate it. And when you're using it with vClusters, that's even better because you don't need a separate vNode for each pod. There's, the overhead is small, but there's still a little overhead. With vCluster and vNode combined, you're actually going to get a vNode for all the pods from the same vCluster, right?
Running on the same
on the same physical node, exactly. So you have less overhead for running vNode combination with vCluster. That's really where the magic of the two products. But you could use vNode just with regular namespaces as well.
Like normally. Okay. Now sounds like very interesting, and I also like it's an interesting direction going from only open source to commercial. Like I think it makes sense, by the way. Like Commodore is a commercial product. Even we have some open source, it's not our core. I was always afraid of like fighting myself. Like it sounds so hard to find that balance because you're actually competing with yourself. No matter how good you are, it's like you're your own worst enemy. And we see it for HashiCorp that like they built a very big company, but they couldn't like explode And compared to the usage of Terraform, they didn't really tap into the potential, right? Like,
I mean,
so
in
it's
retrospect,
tricky.
you know, it's always, obviously we want to learn from mistakes of the past, right? It's always easy retrospectively to say, oh, HashiCorp should have done, you know, like it's easy for us to look
No,
back,
I have
right?
no idea. Well, I'm not sure what's the best way. Like, I feel it's not really, it's not really decisive. And HashiCorp didn't want to create any commercial, right? Like product.
Right.
It was part of like their DNA.
Yeah.
And for better, for worse.
Yeah.
Overall, great product, great company, right?
Yeah. But that's like when you look at the way I'm building the company and my team is building the company with me, right? We are all open source nerds in one way, but we also see that, you know, maybe the first generation of open source companies, a lot of that has led to relicensing and, you know, all these
Redis,
problems.
Elastic, Mongo, right?
A lot, right? So we want to be much more, we don't want to end up doing that, right? So we believe there needs to be a commercial product, and we believe that there needs to be a justification beyond just, you know, support and services, right? For people to say, I'm buying this product, right? And for us, you know, we're being very transparent.
No, I think like the transparency is like the number one key here. And I think, by the way, like this is one of the reasons people were angry on Elastic, right, and Redis, like the lack of transparency. Okay, like I think we're almost done. Any prediction? Like, where are we going as an industry? What's the future have in store for us?
Yeah, this may be a little self-serving, but I think
virtualization everywhere. Like everything's going virtual pod.
I was actually going to say the opposite. I was going to say we're going to see a lot more VMs disappear. I think virtualization in the traditional VM sense, right?
Yeah, I agree.
Is gonna disappear to a large extent, because when you look at something like vNode that allows you to have lightweight virtualization without actual VMs.
Yeah, I agree with you.
And you know, Broadcom probably helps a little bit as well with hiking the prices. We've seen two areas where there's a lot of traction right now. One is GPUs,
obviously,
because people don't want VMs there at all.
No, like over, I agree.
Right? And then we have people that run VMs right now and want to move off of VMs, right?
VM doesn't offer you any big advantage if you're like Kubernetes all in. Like, who cares if the underlying is really like it's not that big as it used to be?
Yeah, we announced a case study, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, with an Australian company called Boston Broadband. They had 200 VMs on top of their, you know, bare metal nodes, right? And the reason why they span up these VMs is that's how they did Kubernetes, right? They needed a control plane node and then 3 worker nodes, right? Like this kind of stuff. They went from 200 VMs, they got rid of all of VMs, from 200 VMs to 0. They freed up 1,000 CPU cores just for the overhead of the VMs, and 1 terabyte of memory freed up immediately by going from virtualized nodes, right, like VMs, to bare metal nodes. They spun up 1 Kubernetes cluster with all of their bare metal nodes, and then they run virtual clusters on top, right? And the only missing piece in such an architecture is, okay, if we need stricter multi-tenancy, how do we do it on the node level? That's why we went down on that level as well.
Okay,
so it's a great case study.
Okay, sounds great. So pleasure having you, Lucas, and good luck. We'll follow up on like the vNode project.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you.
Kubernetes for humans.